Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep your phones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during her presentation or after her presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming dear Professor Jasmijn Bol. Jasmijn Bol is one of the top accounting thought leaders in the world. She is a professor of accounting at the Tulane University. She has been published into ranking journals, including the Accounting Review and the Journal of Accounting Research. Professor Poole has received several awards for her research and teaching, among which the Best Early Career Researcher Award and the Notable Contribution to Management Accounting Literature Award, both awarded by the American Accounting Association. Her last book focused on operational management. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor Jasmijn Bol.
Thank you, Mohamed, for this nice introduction. Good to see so many of you. As Mohamed says, feel free to interrupt at any time with any questions. So I'm just going to approach it like a normal workshop as we do in person. I also want to introduce Connor Brown to you all. He is one of the co-authors on this project, and he will keep an eye out on the chat. If you have a question and you don't like to interrupt, then you can put it there. And the other co-author on this project is Lisa Leveers, but Lisa just had a baby, so she is not here today. But that all went. Cooper is the baby's name, and Cooper wished me a lot of luck today, so trying to make the best out of it. As you know, today I'm going to be talking about context matters, employee preferences for artificial intelligence-driven performance evaluation systems. You might have seen, we've been working on this paper for quite some time, and you might have seen an earlier version presented sometime down the line, but we have made very big changes. Particularly, we've added a second study, and so very curious to know what you guys think of it. So let's get started. Context matters, right? As you'll see, we'll talk a lot about context in which performance happens. All right, traditional performance evaluation, right? We all know, are familiar. We have probably evaluated people. We've been evaluated by managers where performance gets measured and employees are being assessed. So we're familiar with that. And that was kind of the only way, large literature with lots of different ways of designing the compensation contract, the performance evaluation system. And that's what the focus has been on, because it wasn't really viable for an AI to or an algorithm to evaluate our performance. But as we all know, recently there's been a lot of changes in this domain, a lot of developments. So now becomes a question, right? Like, do we want an AI to evaluate our performance? Before that wasn't even a question. Now that becomes a question. And so what do we know about that? Well, first, it's very important to realize that, and this has been shown in our literature, that in order for a performance evaluation system to actually motivate us, we need to, people need to feel that their additional effort is accurately reflected in recognized and rewarded in the performance evaluation system, right? So if I feel that my additional effort will not be rewarded, I'm not going to put in the extra effort, because employees are the first movers, right? So they are the ones that has to decide, yes, I accept this system, I'm motivated by it, I'm going to work for it. So that acceptance is really critical. And we've seen papers, lots of papers, right, on that, maybe not referred to as acceptance so much, but on like, how can we make the performance evaluation system be more motivational for our employees? But none of that has really focused on AI, right? But now that AI is an option, right? An interesting question, an important question is, what drives the acceptance of AI-driven performance evaluation, right? So what can we learn from our management accounting literature and apply that to a scenario where AI is an option? And so in this paper, what we do specifically is we look at the relative preference for AI-driven versus human-driven performance evaluation, right? So where you would have an AI analyze all the data, come up with an evaluation versus the traditional where we have a human manager, right? So those are the two things that we're looking at. And we're specifically looking at relative preference. And the reason we do that is because people in general don't always accept their performance evaluation system, or not fully, right? There are lots of issues, measurement issues, unobservable outcomes. So we want to take those off the table, right? And say, we're looking at relative preferences. So if in the situations, there's some things that don't make you completely accept it, both the AI and the human are faced with that, right? So that's why it's so important to look at that relative preference. So what has the literature told us about that? Like, what have we found as a discipline? So lots of work on performance evaluation, and but none of that work was AI driven, right? And so what has been found about the acceptance of AI? Well, most of the most common finding is algorithm aversion, right? So people in general, there is some extent to which they're uncomfortable with AI. Most of that literature, however, has focused on recommendations that AI makes for them, right? So it's like saying, what's the best way to order your inventory, or what is the optimal number that you should order, right? These types of things. But there's been very little research where AI has been making judgment about employees, right? So now it's like, how well did you do? That's very different from order 2,000 of this inventory and 2,000 of that, right? Is very different from you as a person being evaluated. So we know very little about that, and it's obviously a big distinction, so it's important. I say very little because there is one paper that very specifically looks at this, Newman, Fast, and Harmon. To our knowledge, it's the only paper that has explicitly looked at this before us. But if anybody knows of another paper, please let us know. We're kind of thinking like, can we say it's the only one? Because when do you really know it's the only one, right? But if you know about another paper, please let us know. And so what they find, this is a field study. They find that employees prefer human evaluators to AI-driven performance evaluation systems, even when the outcomes are identical, right? So there's some comprehension, lack of acceptance, lack of trust when it's performed by an AI-driven performance evaluation system. And Newman et al., they argue that this has to do with decontextualization, where people don't take into account the context in which the employee operates, right? So there's too much focus on just the performance measures versus the context in which the employee operates, right? So that's the finding of that paper. And so decontextualization.
Yeah,
It's,
question
oh,
from Robert.
yes,
A
Robert.
quick question, Jasmine. As somebody who has worked in the area of subjectivity, do you understand that decontextualization as a perceived absence of any subjectivity?
Yeah, good question. So actually, that's a perfect segue to this next slide. I was just about to talk about, even though that we in the managerial accounting space haven't really talked about decontextualization, obviously we've done a lot of work on this, right? We've done a lot of work specifically in supervisor discretion, subjectivity, right? Where we show that in places where there's a bigger need to take into consideration the context, we see more discretion, right? More subjectivity, right? So to answer your question, yes, right? If you are purely using objective measures, right? So you would say sales, the only thing I do is just measure your sales, and whatever your sales is, that's what your performance evaluation is based only on, that pure sales number. That would be purely objective, and that would be a high level of decontextualization. So yes, in our traditional performance evaluation systems, we contextualize, right, through subjectivity mostly, right? Although, right, as an AI, you can't really say that it's necessarily being subjective, right? So it's not necessarily true that you can't use objective measures to decontextualize, right? Because you can measure a lot of other variables, you can have weighting formulas, right? So all of that can be purely on numbers, but that's how we as humans don't tend to do that, right? We tend to have discretion in some of the weighting or some of the adjustments that's being made, right? But I don't want to say that it's like if something is completely decontextualized, that means you're only using an objective measure, right? And then if you contextualize, you do that with subjectivity or with very complicated algorithms that take a lot of things into account. Does that make sense, Robert? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that definitely provided some context. A quick theory that just developed in my mind was that we know that many traditional systems use subjectivity even as maybe a weight, that the remaining 20% of your performance is measured subjectively, for example. It could be part of your bonus formula. But even if it is entirely absent, people might think that in some scenarios, humans or supervisors might step in if they perceive the objective measures not to actually capture what's going on. But if I let a machine deal with it or an algorithm, I might not have that trust that a human is ever going to step in. So even if the system is using similar measures, I might have different perceptions or expectations about what is going to happen in certain scenarios.
Exactly, and that's what I'll talk about in a second, right?
Okay,
Right,
cool.
but it's exactly that, right? So subjectivity is often the option, right? It's not, sometimes it's very directly part of the compensation system where, you know, weights aren't determined. Sometimes it's just the option to override what's there, right? So that subjectivity sometimes is made very explicit, sometimes not so much, right? But you're right, it's exactly about the perception, right? It's about the perception, what the manager can and will do, and the perception of what the algorithm will take into account, right? So perceptions are very critical here, yes. And so, and that kind of brings me back to this second bullet point here, that it's really fear of decontextualization that employees feel, what's my evaluator's ability to discern what part of my profit is attributable to effort and what much to the contextual factors, right? So what's the role that the contextual factors play, and is whoever is the evaluator able to discern that, right? To take that into consideration. And so in our first study, we look at the role of environmental stability because this is such an important contextual factor. So what we argue is that when there is environmental stability, right, doesn't mean that there are no contextual factors. It just means that these contextual factors are now identifiable, right? Because it's stable. So we kind of know what's going on. We can collect data on it. And as a result, both AI and human evaluators can adjust for this context pretty well, right? You can get information on inflation rates, competitors' actions, competitor prices, market share, right? Everything that you think, that you know from experience in this stable environment influences performance beyond effort can be considered, data can be collected, and both AI and the human evaluator can take that into consideration, right? And so here's my little graphical representation created by Bing, right? So there's all these things that you know that are going on, right? Performance is influenced by a lot of factors, but we can collect data on it, and both AI and the human can take that into consideration pretty well, right? And it's even humans might lack some of the consistency that is inherent in the AI. In an unstable operating environment, right? So now we're in a situation where for both human and AI, it is harder to really identify what are the factors that are influencing performance, right? So there might be new contextual factors that play a role, like suddenly it's COVID, right? And everything's different. And we argue that employees believe that a human is better in taking into consideration the contextual factors here, these new contextual factors. And so this comes back to what Robert was just saying. It's belief, right? Because it's not necessarily true that an AI, that a human is better in this. I mean, we know from research on traditional performance evaluation, humans work with mental models and have a hard time when something is very different from their mental models, making big adjustments. Humans aren't great at that either, right? So it's not necessarily true that an AI won't do as well as a human, but we hypothesize that that's the belief that people will have, right? That in an unstable operating environment, that trust that an AI will be able to consider these contextual circumstances is lower, and therefore it influences the relative preference, right? So we hypothesize employees in unstable operating environments show relatively higher preference for human-driven versus AI-driven performance evaluation systems than employees in a stable business environment. Okay. Then we test for this, right? In our first experiment, we run a 1x2 scenario-based experiment through cloud research, and people are asked to imagine that they're employees, and they're explained how their performance is being evaluated, and they say that in some parts of the company they've used AI, some parts they used humans, and kind of happy with both of them. So for this new division, they're not really sure what they're going to use, so they ask the participant, would you prefer to be evaluated by an AI system or by a human? And then we ask them to indicate this on a scale to 1 to 5, from strongly prefer human manager to strongly prefer an AI. Right? And then we have the stable and unstable condition. In the stable condition, the current business environment is not different from what happened prior. They have historical data. While in the unstable COVID pandemic, right? We thought of this during the COVID pandemic, so I guess it was the thing very present for us at that time. We also, in our analysis, we do control for algorithm aversion and understanding of AI evaluation. Because prior literature has indicated that that's so critical, we wanted to make sure that we control for that. And so here are our results. As you can see, it's consistent with our prediction. We find a significant difference here, graphically representation. So we see that in the stable, when the environment is stable, that they have a higher relevant preference for an AI system. And when the environment is unstable, then there's a higher relevant preference for the human, all right? So then we also, in order to test our whether our reasoning for a hypothesis is consistent with the result, we do a mediation analysis. And what we find here is that environmental stability affects participants' preferred evaluator by affecting their level of concern about an AI-driven's ability to consider the context in which they were working, right? So we see that in the AI context, there is additional concern as a result of the environmental stability. In the human condition, however, even though there in general is concern about humans' ability to consider context, that is not influenced by environmental stability, right? So there's no difference, like people don't perceive that humans are going to be really different in their ability to adjust if it's stable or unstable, but they do have that significant difference in condition when the AI does it, right? So consistent with our hypothesis. All right, so from this, we learn, right, that identification of these contextual variables, right, being able to collect data on it, identifying them is very important. And so we know from prior literature, from the target ratcheting literature, that relative performance information can actually help in this process, help identify what are the contextual variables, get insights on how they're affecting performance, etc. So we wanted to study, what does that mean for this scenario? What does that mean if you are considering AI-driven performance evaluation and there's access to relative performance evaluation? And you see here, right, the image that I had AI create, there are multiple people all over the place being affected by all kinds of things, but we do have a lot of information because we know about all these people. So the impact, however, of a relative performance information is not necessarily straightforward because it enables both AI and human evaluators to account for common shocks, right? So it's not just the AI that is helped, but it's also the human that is helped by this information. So the effect on their relevant preference is not immediately clear, right? So, but if you start thinking about this deeply, this adjusting of contextual factors is a lot more complex in an unstable environment because these influencing factors might vary among employees, right? So there's more going on. And we argue that due to cognitive limitations, human evaluators will really struggle identifying all of these factors and the different ranges and their varying impact. So think about it like adjustment becomes a very complicated model, right? That in our human brains is really hard to do. And so as a result, we argue that when the environment is unstable, that employees will perceive AI as being better in making all of those adjustments, thereby impacting relative preferences. So our second hypothesis is that the access to relative performance information in an unstable operating environment will result in relatively higher preferences for AI-driven versus human-driven performance evaluation systems compared to the stable operating environment. So we again investigate this in a new experiment, again a 1x2, similar to experiment 1, focusing on that relative preference for AI versus human evaluator, but now there's access to relative performance information. So again, we have stable and unstable condition. We decided not to go with COVID this time because we got some reviewer comments as like, is this unique to COVID? So we wanted to test it in a unstable and stable condition, but slightly different, where in one case everything is highly stable, the other unstable. Then we again control for the same algorithm aversion and understanding AI. And here you see our results. So when RPI is present, when there's relative performance information, we indeed find that in the unstable condition, there is a higher preference for AI. Here is the graphical representation. So in the stable condition, there is relatively higher preference for the human, which is significantly different from the unstable condition where there's a higher relative preference for the AI. Again, we look at mediation analysis to see what role concern for the evaluator's ability to consider context is. And we find that indeed, when we talk about the human, that stability plays a role, right? That the stability affects participants' preferred evaluator by affecting their level of concern about a human's manager's ability to consider the context in which they're working, right? So it shows that how we feel about the human's ability to consider the context is influenced by environmental stability. We don't find this for the AI, right? So environmental stability does not affect participants' concern about AI-driven systems' ability to consider context, okay? And yes. Yes. Okay, any questions at this point before I move on? Yes, Robert.
Do you think that this could generalize to more complex situations? That what you found for the presence of relative performance evaluation could just be that you found a proxy for complexity? That there are situations in general where, or many other situations where people might trust AI more?
Yes, right. Yes, I do think so. You know, I think in the end, it really comes down to how identifiable, right? So in both of the studies, we see that the factors being identified, being able to collect data on it, right? And then that is critical. And then increased complexity makes kind of moves it, right, more to an AI world, right? Where, because, I mean, I don't know if Mac's still here. Oh yeah, you're still here, Max, right? We have a paper on performance evaluation where we just show that if there's too much information to be considered, right, humans just can't do it anymore. And so that's where there's really some weakness, right? In there, I think what we're really trying to do with this paper is show that both of these systems can have their weaknesses and strengths, right? There's things that we as human are still a lot better at than an AI, and there's things that an AI is just better at, right? Like once what you have to consider becomes very, very complex, it's really hard for us to do, right? And so, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I see the relative performance evaluation as a vehicle to have all this information, right? Because if there's no information, if they feel the AI has nothing to use, there's not the confidence, right? We see that from the first study where they really, in that unstable environment, when they think it's new factors, that the AI can't really do that. But when RPI is present and there's, no matter whether it's stable or unstable, there's just a lot more information, right? Once that information becomes too complex, we see that moving to the preference for AI. So yes, I think that really the stable versus unstable, what is the big difference there is the complexity. Yes.
Right. And maybe complexity, the way I introduced it, is not the best way of thinking about it. Listening to your answer, it sounds like people trust AI more with tasks where you need a lot of computational power because there's so much data to process. But then unstable environments have their own complexity, but it's more vague. So I think the common theme there is where humans are good at, or at least where humans believe other humans are good at, is something where you don't need that computational power, but more some interpretive ability, maybe something like experience, something that's harder to grasp. Even if an algorithm might actually be good at it, humans might think that other humans are better at that type of stuff.
Right? Because it's that new factor, right? It's like that things where they're not confident that the AI is going to pick that up, right? But in relative performance when relative performance information is available, there's so much more data, right, on anything that matters, because we now not only know about one employee, but about a lot of other employees and their contexts. So there's this ability to really have a lot of data available. But then once it becomes super complex computations, right, like humans won't do that. They just can't. And so that's where we feel like, oh yes, right, we know that that's the strength of an AI, right? You don't even have to have a model. You can just say, find the relationships, right? Tell me what the contextual variables are. That becomes a possibility with an AI, which is different, right, from our regression analysis in the past that we've been doing, right? So, okay, good. And so next step for us was, we really wanted to make sure, right? So is it true that in an unstable situation, you can introduce relative performance information, and then that improves the acceptance of an AI-driven performance evaluation system, right? Because if I'm an organization and I would like to use AI, and I want to make sure that my employees are receptive of it, so that after implementation, right, it actually has this motivational power, what can I do about that? So in an additional analysis, we investigate the role of relative performance information and algorithm aversion. And so in the same scenario as we use from experiment 2, we also added 2 conditions where there was no relative performance evaluation, right? So we have now a 2 by 2. And we find that indeed our interaction term here is significant. So that indicates that if we add relative performance information in an unstable environment, that this enhances the acceptance of an AI-driven performance evaluation system, right? So unfortunately, right, we often can't pick in what type of operating environment we exist, right? We can't just be like, oh, I'm taking a stable operating environment. That is not a choice variable. But collecting relative performance information is, right? Making that part of the data that is being used to evaluate performance is a choice, right? And so we show that by adding this to the information that is available for evaluator, whether that is AI or human, that this enhances the acceptance of AI-driven performance evaluation, which we capture by looking at the relative preference for AI versus humans. Another thing that is important is the algorithm version here. So what we find is that indeed, right, if people have more algorithm aversion, right, they're less open to performance evaluation by AI. And so that obviously is not super surprising, right? A lot of the prior literature shows that, but I do think it's important to have that confirmative evidence here, because that is obviously also something that an organization can work on, right? Either maybe through hiring policies or through education about AI, right? Reducing algorithm aversion of your employees can also help with that acceptance of the performance evaluation system driven by AI. All right. Any questions at this point? No? So let me talk a little bit about the contributions, right? So first of all, we think we talk about a very important topic here, right? So if we, now that from a technological perspective, AI-driven performance evaluation is something that is really viable, right? There are organizations trying to sell this. Lots of interest from CEOs to use AI performance evaluation systems, which is absolutely not surprising, right? We have decades of literature that shows all the problems in human evaluators, biases, etc. And don't forget about all the expenses, right? Nobody likes to conduct performance evaluation sessions, a lot of time management, employees, right? So obviously having this technology available is something that looks very, very appealing for lots of top management. So there's a huge interest. But what we want to pull attention to that is to that idea of, okay, but it's not just about is it viable, but whether or not it works also depends on the acceptance of the system. Because we know from traditional performance evaluation, if that acceptance is not there, because employees are first movers, right, that confidence is not there, it will not have the motivational power that you're hoping for. And so our paper gives some insights, theoretical insights into those key factors, right? Showing that the identification and data collection on contextual factors is really critical, right? As we were just saying, if people don't have a sense that it's known what those contextual factors are, when there's a lot of uncertainty about that, they don't have confidence in AI, right? We find that in our first study, that then in that unstable world where there are new contextual factors, they have no confidence that AI will actually be able to pick that up and make the appropriate adjustments. And remember, it's all about beliefs here, right? Acceptance is about beliefs. It's not about, right? If a computer scientist says, no, but they can do it because they have this like learning ability, et cetera, doesn't change the beliefs, right? They have the preference for the human because they don't feel that the AI can pick that up in the same way as humans can. And we also show, right, that once a lot more data becomes available through that relative performance identification, relative performance information, once that is available, right, and identification and data is there, then when it moves to a very large complexity, as Robert says, right, for us is that it's the unstable condition where there's just a lot of stuff going on, where there isn't that nice, right, like common shocks that just affect everybody and that are easy for our brains as humans to adjust for. Once that's happening, once our cognitive limitations, our cognitive abilities become a limitation, right, we see again that relative preference for AI increases. And we believe that that also has a lot of practical guidance for organizations, right, that are interested in this topic, is to really, if you're going to introduce something like that, right, make sure that people feel confident that the AI has that information through relative performance information, and be cautious of algorithm aversion, right? So that's really something that as an organization you want to think about. Did you have a question, Max? Kind of looked like you have a question.
As usual, Jasmijn, I have a question that's actually more of a comment than a question. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but the European Union has just passed an AI act, and there's a lot of discussion going on about the operationalization of this act. So essentially, the question is, when is there risk and or no risk involved in deploying an AI model? And obviously, HR is always, performance evaluation of employees is always a very, very sensitive subject, and regulators always want to be very, very careful there. So essentially, my question is, or let's say the comment is, I think you have actually not just practice implications, but also policy implications here. And the question is, how do you think your study can speak to this debate about risks versus benefits of AI with respect to specifically performance evaluation?
I mean, well, thanks for your comment. That is definitely something to think about, something to take into account, right? I mean, I think like how things are being labeled within that, legislation is very important for perceptions, right? If legislation says it's too risky for an AI to do performance evaluation, that's obviously gonna have a big impact on the beliefs, right? Because I mean, acceptance is belief driven, right? And if there's like legislation that says you shouldn't be doing this, and then your organization is doing it, right? Because maybe it's not under European mandate or whatever way that they can get away with this, or and we haven't really talked about, like in our study, we're really about AI driven versus human, right? And obviously using the AI as a decision aid is also a possibility that we haven't really looked at, right? It's kind of like a new can of worms there that is very interesting for us to look at, right? What those differences are, but can't all do it in one paper. But yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely something to think about. And I don't know if I would say it's actually that risky. because it like people don't, their beliefs are based on something, right? I mean, it's not for nothing that when it becomes really complex, the moving towards an AI system becomes more, right, relatively higher preferences. Because I think what is important, and maybe that is something that we as managerial accountants can like share with this debate, is that because you just don't see it just in performance evaluation, but also in hiring, right? There's a lot of like about the bias of the AI and how the AI is not fair, but humans are not fair either, right? Like it's been very, very established in so many papers that humans have all kinds of biases, right? And so I think that as a world, we want to have a good understanding of like the trade-offs of those biases, like which bias might be more extreme in what situation, versus now saying, oh, well, we're not going to move to an AI unless it's without risk, right? Every performance evaluation that has ever been conducted is with risk, right? Like how often doesn't it happen that your supervisor just doesn't like you, or for political reasons, right? You're being evaluated or demoted, or like all of that is happening all the time, right? So I think in this whole debate, it's important to talk about relative risk versus AI being risky versus riskless, because that's kind of something that doesn't exist. But anyways, those are my thoughts from, but it's definitely something worth exploring and worth thinking about what we as a community can add to that debate. Yeah. Kyung-ho, you had a question?
Yes. Hi, Jasmine. Can you hear me?
A little bit louder, but yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so
Yeah,
unplug
better.
phone.
Yeah.
Maybe that's better. So I think, without having read the recent version of your paper, I'm just thinking about the difference between the algorithm and the AI. It seems, based on my understanding, that the model is trained on, like in the performance evaluation context, it would just be trained on past decisions of humans. So in some way, do you see the AI evaluation just being a somewhat weighted model of all the different type of decisions that managers make within the organization, and then the organization is using that data to train the model? Or do you see that as something else? So when you're talking about these human biases, is it just, can we combat the biases just by aggregating past decisions, and maybe we want to overweigh some somebody's decisions who's better at avoiding these biases, and then and that becomes your AI model, versus the algorithm. I guess it's more, it doesn't have that learning aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't see the AI-driven performance evaluation as like necessarily learning from past evaluations, but learning from past, right? Like you see what, let's just say sales, right? And so what was the sales in the past? What has it been over the years? And then having a lot of access to contextual factors, like what was sales under this economic circumstances, this competitors, right? Like what changed in the competitors, and it's like through those contextual factors that you can say, right, the economy became more competitive, right? And so what was considered, that expectation can be adjusted because you actually ended up to be in a more competitive environment than in the past, right? But it's not necessarily going back and then saying, what did the human say about this, right? The human said that this was an important factor. So the AI is learning from the human what an important factor is. I think an AI can teach itself, right? I mean, that's the difference between a programmed algorithm versus an AI, where you just give it the data and say, you know, adjust for the contextual. I mean, I'm just saying, just say that it needs to do this, but like conceptually, right? That's what the performance evaluation is about the AI considering what those weights should be, what factors need to be included versus an algorithm that is designed by a human and just used by an AI, right? Like that would be to me just a simple algorithm that, you know, that's not an AI, right? Like that's just a human using an algorithm because the human designed the algorithm, but an AI is provided with the data and can make these adjustments based on their finding on what the relevant factors are, right? So I do think that in this whole debate of when, right, going back to kind of Max's question, right, we know another area in HR where there's been a lot of AI discussion is in performance selection, right, where people are being hired. And I think that there you see there's often this prediction about success, but then it's like what a human thought success was. And that's the problem, right? Because if a human thought that everybody who was a white male was successful, then obviously an AI is going to say, if that's how we define success, that's what I'm going to find, right? And so I think that in the performance evaluation space, there's an opportunity to not, right, to not just say, this is what the human said in the past, so now use that to predict the future, but as an AI to kind of quote unquote independently look at all of the data and say, what are the proper adjustments that need to be made, making it therefore less sensitive to just pushing forward a bias that was there, right? I mean, I think that's how we, as AI, as long as we feed it biased data, right, then it will have biased conclusions. But if we can feed it information that is just factual, right, that is not touched and being biased, that is not interpretation that the AI uses, I think the chances of that bias not being in there, right?
So
I mean,
yeah, I guess you're basically suggesting that what the AI needs is future performance, I guess. Well, obviously, it's like past data of people who would have been evaluated, their performance, and then in some way, then this kind of evaluation is less crucial even, right? Because once the AI have seen what the person has done, it's already an indication of what this person will do in the future.
yeah, but I mean, in performance evaluation, right? I mean, we're really talking about evaluating things that have happened, right? I mean, it would be, I guess what we're talking about now is if it would predict promotion success or something like that, right? But then it's exactly as you were saying, right? Is that if we are using human judgment to predict future, right, then it's going to have the same biases because that's what in the past judgments was there. But if there's an opportunity to not use judgments, but to use the raw data, right, like that what we're talking about raw data, and the AI determines that, you know, the price of competitors in your region is a critical factor influencing your performance. So if you have the bad luck of being in a region where, you know, there's very full of competitors, your performance number, right, your performance measure shouldn't lead to the same assessment of your abilities and effort as it would if you were operating in an environment where there is not even a competitor, right? So, and that type of conclusions that type of judgments an AI can make based on raw material, right? It's not the human that says to the AI, think about competitors, right? Like competitors have a weighting of 20%. You calculate what that means. No, that's the difference between what we could do in the past, right? Versus AI determining itself, right? That competitor prices need to be taken into account, but maybe it also figures out that it's the combination of competitors' pricing and market share, right? That really is, like, because that's obviously what an AI can do, and that we as humans, we can't do like that, right? I mean, we, as researchers, we try to be really smart, and we try to look at all of but it takes lots of data, lots of time for us to like come to the right, coefficients in our regression models. But an AI, right, like that's just what it does in a couple of seconds, right? So I think it's critical that we realize when we're talking about AI-driven employee performance evaluation, that we're not talking about a computer using algorithms that we as humans designed, right? That's what we had in the past. Now our technology allows us to go beyond that, right?
Okay.
Hey,
Hey,
Anil,
Jasmine,
you
can
had a
I
question?
add to
Oh,
your
yes, of
discussion
course,
there
Connor.
one extra point? But this is not speculative, but there are these existing companies that offer these AI-driven performance evaluation systems, and they don't use the outcomes of previous evaluations. They use inputs, just exactly like Jasmine's saying. So this isn't just something that we're kind of dreaming up. This is really grounded in exactly what real companies are using in practice already.
Yeah. Anil, you had a question.
Yeah, hi, Jasmine. Very interesting work and very futuristic. So what I was thinking is the way I thought about this idea of belief formation. I was wondering, I just wanted to know your thoughts about this, about the fact that in some jobs or in some tasks, there might be more human AI interaction. So when employees perform the task, they actually are using AI systems. So they are using automation. So in that sense, they are aware that the data that is capturing their performance is uh, very objective, or there are systems in place that is capturing objective data. So just wondering if you have any thoughts on this task specific aspect of belief formation. So I was thinking that in tasks where there is more interaction with AI or models, employees are more trustworthy of the system because they don't expect as much human intervention in their evaluations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you're absolutely right that and that's also why we really wanted to work with relative preference for, right? Because obviously things like how you what are even your performance measures? I mean, we have years of research, right, saying that if we feel that it's incomplete or when we feel that it's not capturing long-term impact, I mean, all of these problems that we've had, they're not going to just go away with AI, right? And so that's why in all of this, we have identified some of those things that matter, but there are lots of other factors, right? Like what the performance measures are is going to be very critical, right? And so that's why we kept that constant in both scenarios, right? These people are the human evaluator and the AI will both be working with the same set of data, so things like incomplete measures is going to be the same for both of them. But yes, I definitely think that for future research, we need to figure out and things like, okay, well, if there are a lot of pretty good objective performance measures, we're in a very different scenario than when all of our measures are subjective, right? So if what we care about is leadership, interactions with clients, those types of things, right? Then that is not the forefront of where AI is going to happen and take over your performance evaluation. Because there's one thing for AI to understand the context, and the other is to evaluate your leadership, right? Like that's not just going to happen. And so we're definitely, we've started this, right? Because there's so much more to do, but you have to start somewhere. So we very purposely started it with sales, where there is a pretty good objective measure, right? I don't know about you guys, but when I talk in class about, you know, objective measures that are half decent, I always say sales, right? Because it's just one of the better ones. So that's where we purposely started, just to kind of have that, you know, ability to have at least one measure that is a pretty strong indicator of performance. Obviously, there's still the context that needs to be taken into account. It's far from perfect, but at least it's pretty decent. If you go to a scenario where you cannot even think about one objective measure, you're in a different realm, right? And that's not where AI driven systems are going to go first. How, I don't know what the future holds, who knows, right? But that's kind of later, right? So yes, I think that is something that we didn't look at, but that definitely is something for future research. Yes. Alexandra, hi, good to see you. You had a question.
Hi there. Same here. Very interesting research, but thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I was wondering, like, especially now when you were discussing that, okay, we should consider the different contexts, like where it should matter mostly kind of more subjective evaluation versus maybe objective KPIs. Can you imagine an algorithm that is actually predicting the KPIs themselves, like what to pick for which job, for which activity, for which occupation, so that it wouldn't basically be a tool that is based on what we decide is important, but that actually kind of prescribes us the factors that are important for a certain job?
I mean, I definitely see that as a possibility, as long as there's something objective, right? I see, like, you know how you have leading and lagging indicators. So I think an AI actually would be really good at identifying what leading indicators would be. But I think you do need to have, you know, like, you need to know that your objective is profit in the end, right? Or long-term stock value, right? You need to have something that you know is your desired outcome. And then I think that finding those, like, oh, I think like customer satisfaction is important, but not beyond this point. You know, market share is important. Like all of those things, I think AI would actually be really good at telling you, if you want this, these are some of the performance measures that you can use to guide your employees to focus on the right thing. But I saw, Connor, I saw you shaking, like nodding. Did you want to add something? Because you're like indicating.
Yeah, I just think that I think you're right. I think we've had a lot of discussions about this. Is not just deciding. It is kind of come down to like what weights to place on different measures based on, and maybe that weight should just be 0, or maybe it should be a lot, and that is, I think, within the domain of what a well-programmed AI is capable of doing. Yeah.
I think that there is this recent book which is called Decision-Driven Analytics. So not the other way around, because we usually use this term as like analytics-driven decision-making. And I think that like now you are actually also saying that what is important, that we know what sort of decision do we want to make at the end. And like that's where actually human intellect is more available. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I think actually, you know, maybe in the future we'll have something like the balanced scorecard. The AI would say, this, for this function, this is going to be your balanced scorecard, right? These are, but you know,
Yeah, that would be very
I
time
think that's in
saving.
the future, right? It's like, and that's also why, you know, I have put this on the slide here. This is why, like, we as management accountants need to work with computer scientists because there's so much more possible. But without kind of this guidance of what works for the human side of it, right? For the perceptions, that isn't just about superior technology, but also about the trust and acceptance and things that work for us as humans in order to get it, right, to the best benefits for the organization, right? That's really our role, to indicate like, this is what we need, this is what we trust, this is what we want, and not just, you know, the computer scientists by themselves just working on algorithms that aren't just, you know, are not promoting what works for us as human beings in an organization. So I think there's a lot of really interesting work that can be done in this space. So I'm very excited about it. Maybe Mohamed, is this my cue? Was that like a good sentence? Or do we have more time, more questions? You tell me, Mohamed.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Jasmine, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation, the excellent paper. Thank you very much, all people, or everyone join us today. Thank you very much for taking the time to present to us today, the Professor Jasmine.
Right. Thank you all very much for all your comments and suggestions and things to think about. And it was good seeing a lot of you.
Yeah, and I hope to see you soon in Egypt. You are very, very welcome, dear Jasmine.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Goodbye.